and welcome to NYPD Through the Looking Glass, where you'll get unique insight into the New York City Police Department. Before we get started, please check out my Amazon author page, where you'll find my series of behind-the-scenes NYPD books, $10 paperback, and $2.99 ebook download, including the NYPD's Flying Circus, Cops, Crime, and Chaos. My next guest is a United States Navy Security Forces officer, Master at Arms, who began her career maintaining law and order on a nuclear aircraft carrier before moving on to Guantanamo Bay, where she guarded Al-Qaeda prisoners. I want to welcome my next guest, Lavender Robichaud. Hey, Lavender, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm not bad. We spoke the other day, pre-interview, and I said to myself after we got off the phone, I go, this is going to be a great interview.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you for coming, and tell our listeners a little about yourself.
So I originally from Colorado girl, and just at some point decided that I was going to travel and joined the Navy, and that's exactly what I did.
And what year did you join the Navy?
2008.
And when you joined the Navy, I know like with the military, they give you a series of tests. And they give you options where you'd be good at this or you'd be good at that. Did you originally want to go into the security forces, or did you test well for that?
I honestly had no idea what it was. I really didn't know anything about any of the jobs in the Navy. So as I'm there and they gave me a couple options, like 4 or 5. And the guy was like, well, this one you could play with dogs. And I was like, oh, cool. Sign me up for that.
So you went through your basic training, and then from basic training, they moved you on to police school or a police academy?
Yep.
And what was the training like and for how long?
We did 10 weeks, and it was a lot of not really law enforcement, more security forces, tactical movements, all that kind of stuff.
And what kind of weapons were you trained on?
So Master at Arms is the official title for the military police in the Navy, and that requires us to maintain 3 to 4 different weapons qualifications at all times. So while I was active duty, I was qualified and had to maintain the qualifications on the M9, the shotgun, the M4, M16, and the 240.
Wow, you're a badass. You know how to fire all those weapons. How many MPs are in the Navy?
Actually it's one of the smaller rates in the Navy, so there's less than 10,000 for sure.
It's still a lot. That's larger than a lot of United States police departments. When you work for a police department, you always have in the back of your mind you can be sued for a variety of things. Can another member of the military sue an MP? That is so cool. So you basically have total immunity.
Mm-hmm. So how it kind of works is we really don't do law enforcement. They have DOD, they have federal police officers on most Navy installations, except for the ones that are overseas. Anything stateside, they're going to have federal law enforcement. So those are the ones that really do any sort of law enforcement things that you would see. The military side, we really are just for security forces. So we have essentially the CO of the base, commanding officer of the base, delegates us to have the authority to use his word. So essentially, if somebody says no, they're telling this commanding officer of the base no. So they're not going to turn around and sue the CO.
Okay, no, I understand.
If that makes sense to you.
It does. So when you first got out of your police training, what was your first assignment? Where'd they send you?
So I actually went PRP, and anybody that has anything to do with security forces in any of the branches knows what PRP is. And I was attached with a Marine Corps Security Force Battalion. So my very first job in the Navy was with some Marines infantry who were not very happy that there was a woman with them. Well, there was a group of us. I wasn't alone, but there was about 13 women in the group. and we were one of the first, some of the first women to actually work in there. When I came in, they were transitioning this program over from the Marines to the Navy. And so they were integrating Navy and Marines while the transition happened so the Navy could learn how to do it. And prior to that, there was never any women that worked there because it was all infantry.
And where was that?
That was in Georgia. So PRP is the program that is responsible for the protection of all of the United States' nuclear warheads.
Oh, wow. So you were on a base with nuclear warheads, making sure no one got on the base. Do you get, like, morons that try to slip on there? I'm not talking about spies. I'm talking about just morons that want to take photos or send a drone over or...
Yep.
How often does that happen?
Oh, I mean, probably all the time. Drones and stuff wasn't a thing when I was there in 2008, because I was there 2008 to about 2010, 2011. So drones really weren't popular yet, but we would have constant people trying to climb the fences. There was always like the hippies out there, you're destroying the planet.
So say you catch somebody wandering on a military base. Are they handed over to the local police or are they charged federally?
It depends. So in like the PRP compound, it's actually like several different layers. In the actual place that I worked in, there was probably at that time only about 2,000 people in the world that had access to that particular spot. So you had to get through the initial base, and then you had to get through another inner base, and then this one was a third base inside of a base. So for somebody to actually get in there was not very.
Yeah,
we really actually did have, and it was I think they determined it was a mistake, but there was an airport nearby, and some people were parachuting, and they actually landed right in there. And of course, they're foreign, couldn't speak English, and the Marines just had a heyday with them. They tied them up with their parachutes, and yeah.
Oh, that would probably send off a lot of bells and whistles.
Mm-hmm.
Someone to parachute into a military installation.
Oh, yeah.
Did you spend a lot of time of your career at sea?
I did. So I did while I was in my deployment time. So I was actually attached to a squadron, which is airplanes. And I was a part of an E2C squadron, which is the planes that have the giant dome on top of them. They're the radar up there for all the fighter jets.
Is that the AWACS?
It's similar to that, yeah. And so that was the squadron that I was in, and we would deploy on the carrier. So anytime the carrier in its deployment period would leave, we would leave. So they would do workups, they would do test runs, they would do all this stuff. So we would be gone at least 7 or 8 months out of the year leading up to a deployment. We'd be out to sea. And then during the deployment, really, they say it's 9 months, but it was 15 that we were actually deployed. And then right after that, I moved on to the Truman and caught the Truman on their deployment and did 3 or 4 months on that deployment and then transferred to a shoreside. So
does every major ship have a brig?
No, only the carriers.
And how big is a brig on a carrier?
Holds about 3 to 4 people. They're not very big.
My younger brother was a Marine, or is a Marine, and he spent some time in the brig out in 29 Palms for he was doing fire watch, and somebody was supposed to relieve him, and they didn't show up on time, and then he got into an argument with him, and the next thing you know, they're trading blows, and then they throw them both in the brig, and that was the first time I heard of brig. What is brig short? I know it's the jail, but what's the term? What is it short for?
I have no idea. I'm sure somebody's told me at some point, but I can't remember.
So we were talking about earlier about being sued, and there's a lot of differences with the military police and regular police. Explain to our listeners the bread and water treatment.
So, well, I was actually, like we were talking about, so I was actually informed recently that it sounded like it happened right after my deployment, where I was working in the brig, that they no longer do it. But so what it is they can only do it in international waters because it is illegal, essentially, in the United States to do it. But the punishment is that the person can only drink water and can only have bread for 3 straight days, and they have to stand the entire time.
That's not for anybody that just gets locked up for something. That's got to be someone that's being a real pain in the ass.
So generally they, I don't know, I really don't know how they decide how to do it. Like somebody that has like a severe, like we had a guy that assaulted somebody in overseas and ended up having to get flown off to Germany and things like that. And he was in the brig for 30 days. So he definitely didn't get the 3 days bread and water, but how, like the 3 days of bread and water, that's usually the end of it. And then it's not on their record anymore.
That's not bad. That's like Catholic high school. They'll give you a couple of knots, and then that's the end of it. They won't call your parents.
Mm-hmm.
You were
Yeah.
telling me that the aircraft carriers are like a floating city.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have a Great Clips or PF Chang's?
So they had, we had a ghetto Starbucks. It was ship's people that made the coffee, but Starbucks actually would send us their coffees and their syrups and all that kind of stuff. And they would make us legit like Starbucks coffee. Of course, we had to pay Starbucks prices for it. We didn't get it for free, but there was a little store. There's the little Starbucks thing. There was like a little fast food type restaurant, if you want to call it that. The galley. There's like the main place to eat. There was a place to get haircuts done, all that kind of stuff.
How many people are on an aircraft carrier when it gets deployed?
When it gets deployed, 6,000, maybe 7,000, but around 5 to 6.
Not kidding. That is a city. I can't even imagine something that big to have that many things on there. So when you're on an aircraft carrier, what are some of the things that you have to deal with as far as enforcing the law? I mean, do people get arrested on aircraft carriers for committing crimes or?
Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing was going around and making sure like the secret areas were secured and that there was nobody like trying to break in there. And we would, we had a checklist every couple hours. We'd have to go and check the locks, make sure there was nothing wrong with it. But the biggest thing was just making sure that nobody was having sex was a big one. You'd make sure that nobody was stealing from each other, that kind of stuff. We did have a prostitution ring that they were selling each other to each other, essentially. They were selling out. So the officers, so enlisted all stay in one big room. And there was probably 80 of us in my berthing area, 80 women. And you had bunk beds of 3 racks. There's 3 stacked, and there's about 3 feet between the next one. And so if you can imagine 6 women trying to get dressed in a 3 by 8 foot area, there was a lot of touching. But so they would the officers stayed in rooms where, depending on how high rank they were, they may only be the only one in the room. There may be only 2 of them in the room. I think the most they had was maybe 6 in a room. So they would rent their rooms out to the enlisted, and you would pay each one of them. So if there was like 6 people in the room, you would pay each one of them $50 to be gone for an hour, and they'd give you the code to the room. So we would walk around looking for like enlisted people coming out of staterooms and things like that. We had the reactor department. So the Nimitz is reactor fueled. And so the reactor department was down there. And most of the area down there is top secret. So you really can't, people can't go down there. They were making meth down there. So, and then they were selling that to the people selling the women.
Unbelievable. I'm at a loss for words. If you
Mm-hmm.
get caught, I would imagine the penalty is stiff for manufacturing meth on an aircraft carrier.
They got restriction, so they essentially got grounded and they couldn't get off the ship for 2 port visits.
They didn't get arrested and go to Leavenworth or something?
No, 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 no. The reactor people are very, very smart, and without them, the ship can't go nowhere. So they don't really ever get in trouble.
And there's only that many of them, so they're kind of like a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone commits a crime on a ship, how long, and they're going to be charged. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just like drunken buffoonery. It's something big.
Mm-hmm.
How do they stay on the ship until it goes to a port, or do they fly them off, or?
So we're only allowed to keep people in the brig for 30 days. So generally they have that 30 days to figure out what they're doing with them, and then they'll fly them off. They don't wait until port. They'll fly them off. The risk of them escaping and trying to jump off the ship when we get close to port and things like that is too high, so they generally fly them off in international waters.
I was going to ask you that. Do people fall off the side of those things?
Mm-hmm.
How often do
It's
people? How often does that happen?
accidentally,
Yeah.
like in it's usually like plane involved when like there's something wrong with takeoff or landing or something like that, or like when they're trying to secure things in like high seas or stuff like that, is the most common. I think we had one fall off accidentally on the deployment, and then we had several people jump off and commit suicide, but really if you fall off from that height, there's no saving you really.
Do they have like a procedure where the ship stops and they try to retrieve the body, or they just keep going?
No, so we do man overboard drills on the ship pretty regularly, probably like once a month, but maybe even more than that, where everybody has to get up no matter what you're doing. You stop what you're doing and you go down, and they count everybody and make sure everybody's accounted for, try to figure out who it is, and then they have divers and teams that actually will dive out and go out on the little rig boats and stuff and look for them. But the ship doesn't actually stop. The ship will do specific maneuvers to try to avoid sucking them into the propellers. But by the time that it's all said and done, depending on where they jump off at, the chances that they already got caught up in the propellers is pretty high.
Man, what a way to go, huh? Have you ever had to fly off a ship or transport a prisoner like a distance?
I never have, no.
And were you always in uniform, or did you ever work a plainclothes detail or an undercover assignment?
I did a like a personal protection detail once when I was stationed with the squadron. So the squadron, the base was right outside of Malibu, California, and they were filming one of the Top Gun movies. And so I got to escort around a bunch of the actors in the movie, and that was plain clothes.
Well, that's cool. Did you get any autographs?
There were so many famous people that came there. Met Pink. I've met let's see, Chris Hemsworth. I've met the cast of NCIS. I've met Tom Cruise. I've met God, who else? There's so many people that were there. They used that base all the time for filming.
Cool. And when you guys go to different ports and stuff, do you guys patrol the bars to make sure there's not bar fights?
No, so ship's company doesn't. If we don't pull into a place that is like a Navy base, then there's there's a group of people that are stationed nearby, generally, and they'll come
That's their
over and
job.
they do all that stuff. Yeah.
And have you ever had any escapes on a ship or seen someone
hmm
trying? How often does that
Yeah.
happen?
I would, somebody, every port tries to run away, especially when the deployments start getting longer.
But I mean, what's the punishment? I mean, you're going to get caught eventually. At some point, you got to go back to the United States. I mean, what's the punishment for pulling something like that?
Essentially, I mean, in the documents and stuff, it's there's you still the potential of death by a firing squad, but I mean that
Yeah, I
obviously
could see
hasn't
that.
ever happened. But they make you either pay out your contract or you have to like go and serve the time.
So, what's the most shocking thing you've seen in the military?
The most shocking thing.
Yeah, like were you involved in a homicide investigation or something,
So I have like two that kind of pop into my head. I don't really remember much of the details of the first one. It was um it was in Georgia, and I just kind of remember there was a missing person. I want to say he was an ensign. He was a brand new officer, and he went missing. He had gone out drinking on base at the officers club, and then just never got made it home. So it's kind of swampy there. So we were like told to go look in the swamps, and we found him hanging from. There was no way he did it to himself. He was his feet were 15 feet above the ground.
so it looked like it was a homicide.
Mm-hmm.
Did they solve it?
NCIS took it over, and then shortly after that, I transferred. So I have no idea. But there was no way that he got up there. There wasn't a ladder around. There was nothing for him to stand on. Like he was obviously like hoisted up there.
That's wild.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like something you'd see on a television show. What
Mm-hmm.
was the other incident you were mentioned?
So I was pretty heavily involved in this one. It started out as I was on night shift and driving around, and there's this little girl, and I see her, and it's like midnight, and she's just walking around. She has no shoes on, nothing. I'm like, obviously, I stop and I get her in the car with me, and I'm like, where do you belong? Like, and she didn't want to go home. She's crying, so I take her back to the station, and finally figure out who her mom is. But how we figured it out is because the mom called that she was missing. The little girl would not tell us who her parents were, where she lived. She's covered in bruises. She's real thin. So the mom calls, and the mom is freaking out, and the mom's like, "No, I'm gonna come to you guys. Don't come here." And then when the mom gets there, she's covered in bruises. And I can't remember his name anymore, but I'm sure if I looked it up, I would find it. But he was keeping them locked in a room. The room had like 5 or 6 padlocks on the outside. They had buckets to poop and pee in the room, and he was like assaulting like physically and sexually both of them and things like that. And
And this is
it
on
went
naval
all the
base.
way. Mm-hmm. It went all the way up to court martial, and he did end up going to Levenhagen, I think, for years and years. I can't remember exactly what they gave him, but yeah, there was a lot of like sexual assault and stuff involved with it.
Unbelievable. As a former NYPD detective, I mean, we're used to people not putting their hands behind their backs, running away
Hmm.
from us and fighting. Do sailors and Marines do? I mean, do they usually just give up? Like you tell them, all right,
Oh
listen, pick up.
no.
They'll
Oh
fight with
no.
you.
Yeah, and the Marines are the worst. Oh, the
I was
Marines will
going to
fight
ask you
with
that next,
anybody.
but okay. So no, go ahead. They know
Yeah,
they're already in trouble. Like,
no, no, they will run away. They'll try to climb the fence and get out of the base. And it's like, we know who you are.
right.
We're still gonna find you.
Yeah, it's not like some guy that's not carrying ID and you didn't get his fingerprints and, they go,
Right?
this is a lost subject. I mean, right. All you got to do is a head count and figure out who it is. And if the
Yeah,
guy's that much
exactly.
of an asshole, his roommate's going to give him up. Do sailors fall victim to scams at these ports?
Yeah.
How often? Like, is that that goes on all the time?
Oh yeah. We get port, like they call it port briefs. So things to look out for, places that we don't go, like places that, are dangerous, and they give us like just basic like customs and things like that to kind of look out for just based on where we're going. And so we get told all of that kind of stuff before we hit the port. Of course, people don't ever listen, and they'll come. I remember this guy, we were in Thailand, and I loved Thailand. Thailand was my absolute favorite. There was some weird stuff that goes on there, but they have the lady boys. I don't know if you know what the lady boys are, but in Thailand, in Thailand, the men and women, like the men are very feminine looking, and they're the same size as the women. Like the men are not very big, and they would dress up as women, and they're beautiful, like with long hair and makeup, and they're beautiful. And they would scam the sailors when they would come, and they would rape them and beat them up and steal all their money. And
I had never heard of that before.
Yep.
Are there a lot of suicides on the ships, or how often do you come across a homicide?
Well, there hasn't been any that I've on the ship that I've heard of in a while. I know there's like a lot of stuff happens on port calls. We did have the one guy that stabbed. He got into a bar fight and stabbed the bartender with a broken beer bottle, and that I guess the guy survived, but they didn't expect him to.
Was that out at port or?
We were in Turkey.
So does he get handed over to the Turkish authorities, or does he?
So they try to keep it that they would get charged in the United States. And from my understanding, I think it's different probably in each circumstance, but from my understanding, like UN kind of related countries will allow the United States to charge them. But there's lots of countries that will refuse, and then they would have to go through that country's court process.
So that happens. Where you'll go into a port, do something stupid, and there's nothing anybody can do for you.
Yep. And they tell us that when we get to the port, that if you get caught doing anything here, you will have to stay here.
I wouldn't get off the ship. I'd drink the ghetto Starbucks and read. I wouldn't get off the ship. All right, so if this is what everybody wants to hear, how did you wind up guarding prisoners on Guantanamo Bay?
Just luck of the draw, I guess. It's not somewhere I wanted to go. It was just kind of I was trying to go somewhere else. I was up for, so as a Master at Arms, you have to do what they call an unaccompanied tour. And that's about a year doing something. A lot of people go to Bahrain for it, and I was trying to avoid it. I didn't want to do it. I was like, I've done back-to-back deployments on the carrier, and I feel like I shouldn't have to do an unaccompanied tour. But Navy said I had to, so they sent me there. And I was more admin. I really didn't do much really in with any of the prisoners or anything. A lot of that's done by the Army, I think, is really the ones who guard everything. But we'd swap in and swap out if somebody had to go to the restroom or whatever. And so I just, luck of the draw, I guess.
How many prisoners does Guantanamo hold?
I couldn't tell you. I'm not sure that anyone really knows the answer to that question other than somebody pretty high up.
And were most of the prisoners there Al-Qaeda members that got captured on the battlefield?
A few of them, but majority of them, no. Majority of them were more like internet type of spy people, things like that kind of got thrown under the bus and this and that.
Did you recognize any of them, like the shoe bomber or that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed?
No, I wouldn't have been able to recognize any of them. They all kind of look the same to me. I can't remember what any of those guys looked like. My dogs may start barking. Oh, there they go.
Did you have to deal with any of them?
Anytime that I went around, most of the time they didn't even acknowledge me. They would turn their backs. and they would refuse to even acknowledge I was speaking to them. A lot of them would be very rude and vulgar, and then some of them were polite. Some of them were very intelligent and would, say things like good morning and stuff. And so it was kind of just a hit or miss.
Were there any reports of like the Al Qaeda members ever try to attack staff or try to escape?
No, they didn't. They weren't ever aggressive. It was more of things like persuading people to do things for them. They were very, very manipulative.
Yeah, my brother was a correction officer on Rikers Island, and I had him on the show, and he guarded a lot of high-profile inmates, and he said that some of these guys were like master manipulators.
That's how these were.
Anything, extra water, a magazine, can you get me a message to the outside, things like that. And hopefully nobody falls for it, especially on Guantanamo Bay where you're dealing with the worst of the worst.
Well, I've heard horror stories of women that have actually even had sexual relations with some of them. And so that was one of the things that they would tell us in the training. And
yeah, that's something you should avoid.
Right.
How long were you out there in Guantanamo Bay? A year?
About 6 months. No, I wasn't even there a year. No.
I can't even imagine what it would be like out there. And obviously we're on Cuba. Is there a lot of tension between the United States and Cuba? I mean, are there stories of people trying to defect or run over or either side?
No, not really. It's more of so one of the big things with working there, you didn't wear name badges.
Smart.
You didn't tell them, and they would be one of my good friends that was actually stationed out there with me. When he left, he started getting letters from the prisoners, and that's because they would talk to him, and he would have these conversations, and they would ask, where are you from, where did you grow up, and they were able to figure out who he was, and they would send him letters and like threaten his family and stuff. And so a lot of the people out in town, once they found out that you were in there, they wouldn't want to give you anything. They wouldn't want to tell you their names or information, afraid that you'd pass it on.
Unbelievable. Did you get to meet Fidel Castro while you were out there?
No.
The question everybody wants to know, and it's just between me, you, and a couple of hundred of listeners. Is it true that Cuban cigars are available at the Guantanamo Bay duty-free shop?
Yes.
Lavender, you're a good sport. Tell us about your Early on Wednesday podcast.
Okay, so my podcast is primarily true crime is what I do. I try to spin it on the psychology side. So my degree is in forensic psychology, and I had all the dreams of being like a criminal profiler, and that did not work out because that job is very hard to come by. People don't want to leave it. And so now I work for the state of Maryland as a social worker for severe mental illness. So similar, but not quite as cool.
And go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. What was your question?
No, I was going to ask, where can my listeners find your podcast? Where is it available?
It's available everywhere. So it's on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's on Podbean, it's on all like iHeart, all that kind of stuff.
Okay. And if one of my listeners who works in law enforcement would like to come on your show, is there a way they can get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can reach out to me either on my Instagram, which is early_on_Wednesday, or at my Gmail. It's earlyonwed@gmail.com.
Lavender, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And listeners, listen, check out her show Early on Wednesday. It's a good podcast. That's how I got a hold of her. It's all true crime. You're going to enjoy it. I also want to thank everyone else for tuning in, especially my listeners in Guilford, Connecticut, Sherbrooke, Quebec, and Rockland, California. If you work in law enforcement and want to be a guest on my show, drop me a note on Twitter or Instagram at VicFerrari50. If you enjoyed the content, please check out my books on Amazon. Type in my name, Vic, Ferrari like the car, where you can preview all my books for free, including NYPD Law and Disorder. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll have another episode out next week.
Bye.